Good morning. My name is Jeremiah Ellison. I am the chair of the Council's Elections and Rules Committee, and I'm going to call to order this regular meeting of the committee. Joining me at the dais today are Council members Palmisano, Johnson, Goodman, Warsame, Schrader, Cunningham. I always do this. And Fletcher, sorry. And these total brain freezes. And Gordon. Let the record reflect we have quorum. Colleagues, we have two items on the agenda today. First, we have some proposed changes to the city's code of ethics, which is the subject of the public hearing. Second, we will receive the report on final plans and preparations for the 2018 gubernatorial elections. And so the first item today is for the Ethics and Government Ordinance. We have our Ethics Officer, Assistant Attorney Susan Trammell, here to present the ordinance and explain the changes that are being proposed. And after that, we will open the public hearing. We've also been joined by Council President Bender. Oh, and Council Vice President Jenkins. Ms. Trammell, thank you.
Good morning, Chair Ellison and members of the committee. It's Susan Trammell here as City Ethics Officer, and I'm pleased to bring forward to you for your consideration some proposed changes to the Minneapolis Ethics and Government Code. The changes that are before you today, the impetus comes from state legislature. In the last legislative session, the Minnesota State Legislature made changes to the Statement of Economic Interest statute. Because of those changes were necessitated in our Statement of Economic Interest provision. Taking advantage of those state legislative changes, we made a number of simplifications to the Statement of Economic Interest ordinance. We just referred directly to the state statute and took out additional requirements which all would have needed changing to conform with state law. And then we also added a provision delegating duties to making sure that in the city this process happens, and it happens in compliance with state law. There are a few changes that, given our movement to conform with state law, you no longer need to report loans. And in my 12 years as ethics officer, we've only had 2 people report loans in that time. And they were both reporting loans that need not be reported. So one was reporting their home mortgage and one was reporting student loans. So neither of those needed to be reported. We don't think that we are lessening our ordinance and changing the manner in which we do the reporting. The other change is that there no longer will be reporting of the financial interests of your spouse or domestic partner. The Ethics Board has discussed this, and they do not believe that that will also lessen the ordinance because we still have some disclosures that would be required when the financial interests of a spouse or domestic partner come up in city business. So those are the changes that will be made to the Statement of Economic Interest ordinance. At the same time, the state legislature added a definition for financial interest in its conflict of interest statute. We also adopted that definition and made corresponding changes to our conflict of interest ordinance. The changes, which look like quite a few in our conflict of interest ordinance, are actually not as extensive as they look on the front page of the ordinance. A lot of the definitions that were in there were moved to the definitions section, and some of which had definitions already, and they were conflicting in the language between the section of conflict of interest ordinance and the definitions section. So we've cleaned that up. So now all the definitions are in that section. We also have narrowed a financial conflict of interest to be that just of the interest of the person, the elected official, or the employee who's participating in the city government business. We have left the disclosures, though, for when the relative has a financial interest. So if you have a relative with a financial interest, there are still some disclosures, but it doesn't rise to the level of your financial conflict of interest. This will simplify the reporting. the use of the state form for financial conflicts of interest, and the use of the city form for the relative potential conflicts of interest. So those are the main changes. We also, because of the opportunity to go through a number of sections, took the opportunity to change all use of genders to make it gender neutral throughout these ordinance sections. I can stand for questions if you have any.
Thank you, Ms. Trammell. Before we open the public hearing, are there any initial questions from my colleagues? Councilmember Gordon.
So in terms of the loans, there were some kinds of loans that we weren't supposed to be reporting, but there were some that we were supposed to be reporting. So what were the kinds of loans that we currently now would be reporting and required to report that we no longer will have to report?
If you proceed,
If this
Councilmember
passes, of
Gordon,
course.
with these changes, there would be no loans reported on a statement of economic interest form.
I understand that. What I'm curious about is what should be reported now. So if I get a loan from a big property owner, let's say the Polads, who own United Properties, decide to give me a loan for $100,000, would I have to report that now?
Chair Ellison, Councilmember Gordon, you would not have to report that under these rules,
I mean,
even under
old
the
rules.
existing rules.
What kind of loans would I have to report?
Things that would not be done at arm's length transaction.
This was not I was describing a non-arm's length transaction. I'm in trouble. I forget the Polad's first names, but play out that scenario. I go, or maybe to Casey Carl. Let's take the
Yeah.
out of it. I go to Casey. I say, I'm kind of in trouble. I'm behind in something, and Dad, I need $50,000, and he gives me a loan. It's between the two of us. It's not somebody else taking it out for me, so it's not necessarily arm's length. Would I be required to report that now?
Chair Ellison, Councilmember Gordon, no. I mean, under the current, you should disclose it on a statement of economic interest, but you probably wouldn't because you'd probably be in violation of federal law and be indicted.
So we would be required to report it on the form now,
Right,
and we no longer will be,
no.
even though it clearly would be considered.
It would be a
Wrong.
violation of other laws, so I'm not sure that anyone
Council
would
members
report it.
Can we take personal loans from friends or relatives?
For clarification, Mr. Chairman, are you saying that would be the hypothetical that Councilmember Gordon is proposing would be a violation whether he reported it or not? Correct? Is that what you're?
Chair Ellison, yes, I believe, without more facts, but I think that
I don't want to distract
reason-
us with the specifics either. I'm trying to understand what we would be disclosing now, what kinds of loans. Sounds like you're saying loans that aren't made at arm's length
yes.
would have to be disclosed now.
now.
I'd rather find an example that doesn't violate federal law. I was assuming a loan between friends wouldn't necessarily violate federal law. So I pretend it's my neighbor, my friend, my cousin, I don't know. I would have to disclose it now so everybody could see later that, oh, this property owner in Minneapolis had loaned somebody a bunch of money. Under the new rules, we won't have to disclose that.
Chair Ellison, Councilmember Gordon, that is the intent, that they not be disclosed because it's not been used over the last 12 years. It's been only used twice, and it was not used for the intended purposes. We just are not seeing
I understand
this
the reasons.
information.
Right, I remember you said that earlier.
And the decision that was made at the ethics board level is that we're requiring, and we'd have to file a state form and a city form going forward. So,
I just wanted clarity on
and
that.
that's why they chose
not
that
gonna
it
get reported
wasn't
anymore.
accomplishing.
I get the reasoning. I just wanted clarity for everybody because it wasn't really said. And if a matter came up before the council or the planning commission, and let's say they had got a loan from somebody who had a development project or maybe a rental license revocation, a liquor license, some kind of business before the city, would we be required to disclose that we had a loan from that person?
Chair Ellison and Councilmember Gordon, you have now raised what would be deemed a potential financial conflict of interest, and that would require disclosure.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know that there's a choice to not do this. We need to be consistent with the state. Can you tell us that there will be additional transparency in us doing this in parallel with the state? For example, will people be able to more readily, when they need to go and look at it, view our statements of economic interest? Is there any enhanced capability that we have in mimicking how the state does it today? Is my question.
Chair Ellison, Councilmember Palmisano, the changes in transparency will be unnoticeable. The forms will still be filed with the city clerk and audited by the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board, and they are the ones who develop the form. So there's no change in access from any of these changes. They're still public. Everyone who wants to see your statement of economic interest form can still request it.
Mm-hmm. If I may, most of these changes are good. They're definitional. They include the roles and responsibilities of you, our ethics officer. Mm-hmm. I do want to question why the city would weaken overall our disclosure requirements to track more closely with the state when the state requirements receive some pretty bad ratings from national organizations. For example, the Center for Public Integrity ranked Minnesota a D- on a report on the specifics of economic disclosure requirements. Specifically, they got a score of 25 out of 100. And while that's maybe not the best grading system, I think I am concerned whenever we are seen as lessening the transparency of our government. So one question that I had, and I don't fully remember all of the details of it, but I do believe that a previous governor, Governor Pawlenty, was once upon a time a consultant, so not receiving a service or affiliated with an actual association, but affiliated with a person from which he was receiving a fair amount of money per month. And because the state legislature's reasons to disclose said it had to do with an association instead of an individual paying a politician, he didn't need to disclose it. And so my question to you is, in our ordinance here before you today, does that would something like that be required? Not that I think that it's happening or ever has in our city government, but I believe that in the state legislator ordinance, there is something that refers to being paid by an association, and I'm wondering if that also would include whether a person, an individual, is paying somebody. In this case, I believe it was Governor Tim Pawlenty. While he was governor, I believe he was getting paid $5,000 a month as a consultant through an individual. Would something like that need to be disclosed?
Mm-hmm. Chair Ellison, Councilmember Palmisano, the language regarding the disclosures of receipt of money has not changed from before. There have been situations in the past where an individual has received money in their individual capacity and did not disclose. And the rationale that at the city was that it wasn't meeting the definition of associated business under our ordinance, which is the same definition as of state law, always has been. There has been language in the Statement of Economic Interest Manual that has been published by the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board about if you receive more than $250 in any month, that's income to be disclosed. And so my position and that of the Ethics Board is that even though it's not your associated business, it should still be disclosed because you've received that as income in a month.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And Council Vice President Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Ellison and Ms. Trammell. I just wanted to acknowledge and express gratitude for replacing gender-specific language, which was sort of unnecessary, with gender-neutral language, and hopefully we can continue to make these corrections or subtractions, as it were, in the future around language in our ordinances and policies. It's superfluous and really doesn't provide much purpose. And so I appreciate the efforts that you took in this policy, and hopefully we can continue that as we continuously look at our ordinances and language. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Schrader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to echo a lot of the concerns of Councilmember Palmisano that we do have a ranking that's pretty low on this. That said, I think the balance, I will be supporting this. I think the balance of the administrative burden that the city would be under, that it places with being out of compliance with what's going on at the state, is overshadowed by, what we would actually gain by having stricter laws here than that's at the city. I think, though, that if you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but a lot of the states that have much more strict laws around transparency and disclosure, they have a much different history than Minnesota. They have a history where they've had specific scandals that those laws responded to. I mean, I'd urge the state to work proactively and have stricter laws around transparency and disclosure, but as I see it right now, these changes were responding to a history that we have and trying to balance that with what we would actually gain with the kind of the administrative burden that we'd face.
And Councilmember Schrader, I have been working with the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board and have been in discussions with them and encouraging them to encourage their board members to pursue strengthening of their statutes. So those discussions are ongoing. Sometimes things take longer than we wish, but certainly we'll keep an eye on those potential changes and be supportive of them should they come up at the legislature.
Awesome. Not seeing any further questions, I guess we can go ahead and open the public hearing. Thank you, Ms. Chairman.
Thank you, Chair Ellison.
And so are there any members of the public who would like to speak on this issue? Anyone at all? Awesome. Seeing no one stepping up to speak on this issue, I will now close the public hearing. Any last comments from colleagues? Oh, Councilmember Gordon.
Well, I can appreciate that we want to align our forms and make it more efficient here. I do worry a little bit about looking at the state legislature to help set what we think are our standards that we should always be following. And I actually think it was helpful that we had to think, at least when we're filling out our form, okay, do I have any personal loans or loans that are like that I should disclose? It probably also would help people think about, oh, maybe I shouldn't be like seeking those or taking those if I'm not willing to share them broadly with the public. I also thought it was really helpful to be able to say and have people have access to where our spouses were working so that they could also understand, oh, there could be some kind of conflict of interest related there. So these changes do worry me a little bit, that it's going to either help somebody make a mistake, to not disclose something at the right time. It's not as clear and simple when it's on your statement of financial interests, where we list the properties that we own and the other things that we put down so people can find them. So I don't really necessarily want to have any amendments to propose or stand in the way of this, but I think it's unfortunate. I actually thought we didn't necessarily go far enough in other directions. Gifts and things can be done for our family members that could have the appearance that we might be also benefiting from those, and they're allowed. And certainly they're allowed at the state level and they're allowed at this level. I also think I have a little bit different kind of expectations about elected officials and what we should be doing, and then other people in the city. So, and I know that our statement is similar. So I guess with some reluctance, willing to go along with this, but hopefully we can keep an eye on these kinds of things and have a better understanding. I do know that there were councils in the past where council members have made serious mistakes and blunders or really bad decisions that resulted in some significant consequences for them. And I think some of them even involved loans from potential developers at one point. I believe that was the case in the 8th Ward, but that was before I was on the council. So I think having the rules and all those regulations also help us behave better and make it aware of people who aren't even thinking about that, and they realize, uh-oh, danger, I'm not going to go here. And hopefully we'll still be doing that and trying to do that. Actually, a lot of those mistakes were made before there was even an ethics code. So hopefully we still have a strong enough ethics code so people will be thinking twice before they make some bad decisions.
Thank you, Councilmember Gordon. I do want to say that, I think that we're all interested on the council in making sure that we have increased transparency, and I appreciate my colleagues raising the concerns that they're raising. I also want to thank Ms. Trammell for your leadership in pushing the state to make sure that we're not being lax or in any way relaxing our rules when it comes to our code of ethics. And so, but I also want to thank you for making these revisions, because I think that it does add some clarity and streamline some things. And conforming with the state, I think adds a level of legibility so that, if people are trying to track down this information, it's not different here and different there. And so I want to thank you for that. Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be supporting the changes today, which I think are reasonable for the reasons that people have talked about. I do want to just take a moment to note that this is in a context of a city that takes ethics very seriously. And the ethics training that we all went through together at the beginning of this term, I thought was a really good opportunity for council members to be reminded of the rules that we must follow and also the resources that are available to us. And I've always found it so helpful to be able to pick up the phone or email and ask our ethics officer questions. I think that's kind of a critical piece that came out of our very long ethics training. Again, for me, was that you should always ask first, and our intention is to always be following the utmost standards of ethics, but to just remind ourselves to pick up the phone and ask our ethics officer, I've been invited to do this thing. Is this in line with our rules? Or even questions about our family members, our spouses. And I think, again, holding ourselves to that standard is really important. And I think we have the tools in place that we need as a city to make sure that that keeps happening.
Thank you. And with that, I will move to approve the changes proposed to the Ethics in Government Ordinance as presented by staff. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and the ordinance will be forwarded to the committee's recommendation to approve for the full City Council at its regular meeting this Friday. Next, we have the staff report on final plans and preparations for the 2018 general election. Here to present that report is our City Clerk, Casey Carl. Good morning, Mr. Carl.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. As noted, my name is Casey Carl, and I have the privilege of serving as the City Clerk for the City of Minneapolis. And on behalf of the Elections and Voter Services team, many of whom are with me here in the chamber, I'm here to present a report on the final plans and preparations for the 2018 gubernatorial general election. A copy of the staff report was distributed to your offices yesterday, at which time the full report was also posted for public access to the city's legislative information management portal. There are a few additional printed copies available from the clerk. This first slide captures the major dates that remain in this year's election. Of course, as provided by state law, Election Day itself will be on the first Tuesday following the second Monday in November. This year, that means all polls will be open to serve voters on Tuesday, November 6th from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. Prior to that time, of course, we continue to welcome voters at our Early Vote Center, located just one block northwest of us here in downtown Minneapolis. And of course, we continue to expedite service to voters who choose to vote by mail during the 46-day absentee balloting period that runs through 5 p.m. on Monday, November 5. For those voters who do choose to take advantage of the vote by mail option, we strongly encourage that completed ballots be put back in the mail to us by no later than October 30th, just to assure a sufficient period of time to have that ballot returned to us here at City Hall. So to review for those who may be monitoring from home, voters can continue to exercise their option of voting early in person at the city's Early Vote Center located at 217 3rd Avenue South now through Monday, November 5th. In the final 2 weeks, starting next Monday, October 22, the Early Vote Center will be extending its in-person service hours from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday and adding weekend hours as well. Direct balloting runs October 30th to November 5th in the final 7 days of early in-person voting. And in an effort to expand access, the city has planned to open 3 additional early vote centers to take the ballot out into the community. All 4 early vote centers will be operating on those extended hours I mentioned to give greater opportunity to voters who wish to cast their ballots in person before Election Day. EVS continues to receive and respond to requests for absentee mail ballots. We highly encourage, as I said, voters choosing to use vote by mail option to make sure that their completed ballots are back in the mail to us by no later than Tuesday, October 30th. In prior checks in election years, we've learned that it can sometimes take as much as 7 days to get a completed ballot returned to us. Therefore, we urge voters who choose to use vote by mail to put their completed ballot back in the mail to us by October 30th. And of course, we look forward to welcoming voters to the polls on Tuesday, November 6th for the big show between the hours of 7 a.m. and 8 p.m. Details about these 3 methods of voting, our public service hours, and the locations of our early vote centers and all of our polling places are available from the elections website at vote.minneapolismn.gov. This year's primary set new records for participation, as reflected on this slide. And as you can see, Minneapolis experienced the highest turnout for a primary this year since 1968. That's a 50-year record. The level of participation this past August was so high, in fact, that it was on par with what we would normally anticipate for the midterm general election in November, not the primary leading to the general election in November. Nationally, more than 40 million Americans voted in this year's primaries, which was a staggering increase compared to turnout for the 2014 primary just 4 years earlier. And it's a sign of an almost unprecedented voter enthusiasm leading up to the November midterms. In Minnesota, we achieved a 22.7% turnout of our eligible voters in the primary, and that was more than double the turnout from 2014 and was the highest achieved in the state of Minnesota since 1994. Here in Minneapolis, we experienced a 35% total voter turnout for our primary. That reflected, as shown on this slide, 101,266 ballots being cast. And again, as shown on this slide, it completely blows away our prior turnout records from years clear back to 1968. And the only reason that we stopped at 1968 is that was the farthest year back we had electronic data available. So it's highly possible this is the record for even more years beyond that. But certainly over the last 50 years, this year's primary had the highest level of participation, setting a new record, regardless of whether that was for a presidential or a midterm election. As of this past Thursday, October 11, the Secretary of State's office reported that a total of 223,688 absentee ballots had been issued across the state, and that of that total, 85,438 completed ballots have already been returned and accepted by local election officials. That is 3 times the total number of voters who voted by this same point in time in the 2014 midterm election. Again, that reflects an increase of 209% between the last midterm 2014 and this year, and it's nearly on par with the 2016 tally. In fact, we're only about 15,000 ballots short right now of the total level of absentee ballots turned in for the 2016 presidential election. So as numerous reports have already indicated, this all points to a potential for a very strong midterm turnout in November. And while analysts continue to monitor turnout, the other election issue that has dominated national news is security, cyber attacks, and the threat of interference in the upcoming election. In fact, we just got a report this morning from our colleagues at the DHS about potential attacks. So, the Center for American Progress, in a report entitled Defending Americans' Elections, graded all 50 states on the status of their respective preparations for securing the election. This slide shows the grades assessed for each state based on a number of factors. Those factors included the minimum cybersecurity standards for a centralized voter registration system, the certification requirements for voting systems that are used, standardized pre-election testing of systems and equipment, the use of voter-verified paper ballots, verifiable ballot accounting and reconciliation procedures, and post-election audits that evaluate the accuracy of the tabulation systems. Unfortunately, not a single state in the Union scored an A. In this evaluation, however, 9 of the 50 states did receive a score of B, and I'm happy to report that Minnesota was among these top-ranked states. Though not perfect, Minnesota's high grade reflects the fact that across all of these categories, the state adheres to several important minimum cybersecurity best practices. It uses voter verifiable paper ballots and mandates pre-election testing of all voting systems and equipment prior to every election. Another area where Minnesota was recognized as a standout amongst all states was the fact that it mandates that all of our electronic voting systems be compliant with the voluntary voting system guidelines promulgated by the United States Elections Assistance Commission. Recognizing that the security of elections is an issue of vital national interest, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security took the unusual step of designating election infrastructure as part of the nation's critical infrastructure. This designation means that the Homeland Security Department takes the lead in terms of coordinating all security-related matters that impact elections, working in partnership with federal, state, and local election officials, election-related organizations, as well as the private sector. Under this federal designation, some of the specific components that have been identified as being covered include our voter registration databases and our associated technology systems for voter registration, the systems and equipment that we use to count, audit, and display election results and post-election auditing and reporting, the storage facilities for election and voting systems and equipment, and our polling places, including early vote centers. The federal designation from the Department of Homeland Security opens access to a number of important resources, providing continuous monitoring, incident management and response, and best practices that relate to identifying, assessing, mitigating, and countering potential or actual threats to the nation's election infrastructure. In this regard, Hennepin County is the only jurisdiction in the state of Minnesota that completed a cyber resiliency review and vulnerability test, which was conducted by a team from the Homeland Security Department. As part of that assessment, every piece of our equipment and all of our systems were tested through each step of the election process. And because the county encompasses the city of Minneapolis, we were able to benefit from that evaluation as well, giving us a higher sense of confidence in the systems equipment that we use here in Hennepin County. As noted in the National Survey of State-by-State Security Evaluations, part of the success story in Minnesota is the result of a few critical factors which set us apart from other jurisdictions. These are noted on pages 4 through 6 of the report. Included among these factors in Minnesota is the fact that we offer voters the benefit of same-day registration. In fact, because Minnesota provides the opportunity for voters to register at the polls and vote on the same day, it was one of a handful of states that was not subject to the federal requirement for provisional balloting under the Help America Vote Act of 2002. Like almost all states, however, Minnesota does require voters to be registered in order to be issued an official ballot. Only North Dakota does not require its voters to be registered. In Minnesota, voter registration is managed through a centralized database that's maintained by the Secretary of State. By cross-checking registration data against eligibility criteria, election officials help to protect the integrity of each election. Minnesota also is one of only 24 states that participate in the Electronic Registration Information Center, ERIC, known as ERIC, which tracks registration data from participating states' voter registration systems in order to validate records and to eliminate duplications across multiple jurisdictions. In addition to the DHS designation, the U.S. Congress appropriated funds to help bolster election security in all states. Of that total authorization from the federal level, $6.6 million was allocated to the state of Minnesota, and Secretary Simon had advocated to use those monies to upgrade the statewide voter registration system, which is now more than 14 years old. Unfortunately, despite the Secretary's best efforts, those federal funds fell victim to politics at the state legislature, and thus not one penny of those funds has been made available to local jurisdictions, including Minneapolis, to prepare our security for this year's critical election. Other important factors in the security of Minnesota's elections include the fact that we use voter-verified paper ballots, which, if necessary, can be used to recreate an election with a manual hand count process of all ballots to validate the results. It's important to emphasize that there is no such thing as a 100% secure voting system. All voting systems on the market today are susceptible to tampering and are vulnerable to hacking and other forms of cyber attack. That's why it is so critical that other forms of security be used to offset or to mitigate against these electronic risks. According to a report released earlier this year by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, the most important protection we can offer is the use of paper ballots. This national committee, which was made up of computer science and cybersecurity experts, legal and election scholars, social scientists, and election administrators, concluded that no electronic voting system can guarantee the secrecy, security, and verifiability of ballots. As a consequence, the committee's recommendation is that all jurisdictions should use voter verifiable paper ballots that can be used to validate election results through a hand count process if necessary. In this regard, Minnesota is at the forefront of safe election administration because our state law mandates that we use paper-based systems, and this ensures an auditable process. Also, state law recognizes the paper ballot as the official record of an individual's choices made in an election. So if there's any question between the results produced by the machines that we use or a manual inspection of the official paper ballots, the default is to the official paper ballot. Finally, Minnesota law requires logic and accuracy testing of all of our voting systems and machines prior to every election. And that testing process, which is known as the public accuracy test, is open to the public, news media, candidates, and others. And following each election, the state also requires a randomized post-election audit that examines the results of selected precincts compared to the unofficial results produced by our voting equipment. These tests and post-audits also help ensure the integrity of every election, and they help to solidify voter confidence in the accuracy of our elections in Minnesota. We can now add that these processes also help protect our elections from outside influence in forms of attack. And in Minneapolis, the Elections and Voter Services Division has developed a very thorough set of procedures that relate to chain of custody, which support and enhance these statewide security measures. So, for example, in Minneapolis, all of our printed ballot quantities are verified by election judges twice. All ballots are retained in a secured vault at all times prior to and after Election Day, and access to that vault is tightly restricted. All voting machines, including our assistive voting devices, are tested and verified at least twice, and then certified for accuracy as part of the state-mandated public accuracy test before every election. The transfer of ballots follows strict standards that require a minimum of 2 individuals at all times, as well as written acknowledgments for any transfer of ballot or vote data between jurisdictions. And our ballot data from all precincts is transmitted via secure modem after polls close on election nights, and those modems never remain connected during voting, which is consistent with guidelines from the National Elections Assistance Commission. So again, while it is impossible to say that any system is impenetrable and absolutely secure from attack, I believe that the evaluations conducted by these outside agencies, as well as by our own state laws and local policies, demonstrate that our elections in Minnesota are safeguarded, are secure to the greatest extent possible, and provide additional assurances to verify and validate results in the event of an actual or possible breach of our systems. As already noted, early voting has been significant both for this year's primary and headed into the November general election. The 46-day absentee balloting period opened on Friday, September 21, and it will close at 5 p.m. on Monday, November 5. On the first day of early voting, we served more than 10,000 voters. 119 of those were voters who cast their ballots in person at the early vote center. Whereas in prior elections, the turnout had shown an increase in in-person early voting, and we'd seen that ramp up year after year. This year bucked that trend. In fact, most of our early voting has been through the vote-by-mail option. Just this past Monday, EVS received a total of more than 1,000 completed absentee ballots that were returned in the mail. This chart shows a comparison of this year's early vote participation compared to the even-numbered years back to the 2000 presidential election. And you can see that the trend for early participation has been increasing over 2 decades, hitting a record-setting level in the 2016 presidential election when more than 60,000 voters cast absentee ballots. Each week, EVS provides policymakers a statistical report showing a breakdown of absentee balloting for both in-person as well as vote-by-mail totals. And this slide includes a summary of that report through this past Friday, October 12. As you can see, as of this past Friday, EVS had accepted 7,458 completed official ballots. And I can share now that the number has increased to 9,318 as of 5 p.m. last night. Based on the city's pre-registered voter population from January this past year, or in this year, this reflects approximately a 4% turnout thus far, with 20 days remaining until Election Day. I'm very proud of the incredible work that our early vote center teams have done, and they provide the best voter service possible for those who choose to vote early in person or by mail. As media outlets have been reporting this past week, the rush of absentee voters this year has exceeded what would normally be anticipated for a midterm election. The numbers of absentee voters we've seen thus far is more typical, as I said, of a presidential election. So that's what election administrators have been doing across the state and here in Minneapolis, adjusting our plans to align our resource requirements for a presidential election. Right now, Hennepin County, which includes Minneapolis, is on track to surpass the total number of absentee votes cast in the 2016 presidential election. And as I said, this increased turnout is being experienced across the entire state. Right now in Minnesota, voters have already cast triple the number of absentee ballots as they did in the midterm of 2014. This slide shows the final 2-week stretch into Election Day, and I'll note that EVS plans to extend its in-person service hours. This extension of service hours is consistent with policy direction from Council the last term. Consistent with that direction, and starting just next Monday on October 22, the Early Vote Center will be open on weekdays from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. Just by adjusting our weekday hours this little bit, EVS will be offering a total of 125 additional hours over the course of the final 2 weeks to accommodate in-person voters at our early vote centers. Under state law, election office must be open to serve voters from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. on the Saturday just prior to Election Day. This year, that's November 3. But thanks to the support of the mayor and council, Minneapolis exceeds those required hours by actually offering Saturday in-person service hours on both Saturdays that lead into Election Day. That's October 27 and November 3. And we offer hours from 9 a.m. until 4 p.m. for a total of 14 hours of service for our early voters. And we will once again have in-person service hours on both Sundays, October 28th and November 4th from 12 noon to 5 p.m., which adds 10 more service hours to accommodate early voters. These extended hours mean that Minneapolis offers its voters a total of 144 service hours for in-person early voting above and beyond the city's regular operating hours and in addition to those required by state law. The practical reality of all those extra hours means that Minneapolis offers its voters more in-person service hours and access to the ballot box than any other single jurisdiction in the state of Minnesota. And as I've alluded several times now, in response to this council's direction, we will be opening 3 additional early vote centers in conjunction with direct balloting, which is during the final 7 days of early voting, October 30th to November 5th. The operating hours for those additional sites will match those of our downtown location, which is shown on this calendar. So in addition to the increased hours, we're now increasing our locations, all of which means Minneapolis is offering the broadest access possible to its voters, more than any other single jurisdiction in Minnesota. And I'd like to note here and remind everyone, especially for those voters who may be watching, that early vote centers are not open on Election Day. This has been a problem for us in the past. On Election Day, the city welcomes voters at their assigned polling places, which reflect the 132 precincts in the city. However, early vote centers are not open on Election Day, so voters should not plan to show up at one of our early vote centers on Election Day to cast a ballot. Speaking of precincts, this slide shows how the city's 132 precincts break down in terms of the number of pre-registered voters being served in population terms. Remember that voters are assigned to a specific precinct based on their residential address. This slide also shows that EVS has planned for the average precinct to be staffed with approximately 11 positions throughout Election Day. Additional staff positions are allocated and assigned based on the population being served. So we assign more judges to those polling places based on specific criteria unique to each of the precincts, which might include higher density areas, the need for translation and interpretation, registration specialists, or other kinds of personnel that are tailored to the needs of each precinct. Based on the significant turnout in this year's primary, our initial plans for the November general election have been upgraded. As I said, we are now resource planning on the par of a presidential election. And based on those trends, we plan on deploying approximately 1,900 election judges to the polls on Election Day, not including our student judges. To put that number into perspective, the city enterprise has roughly 4,000 full-time positions. With 1,900 election judges, that means that Elections and Voter Services is challenged with recruiting, training, and assigning a temporary workforce for this year's election that's approximately equal to 47% of the city's full-time workforce. To achieve this extraordinary goal requires year-round work from a small team of 5 full-time administrators, and we could not be successful in that regard without the strong partnership of our Human Resources Department. So I wanted to pause and thank Patience Ferguson, our HR director, and her team for their partnership in helping us to recruit a significant volume of people to help work the election. And of course, it goes without saying that we could not conduct an election without the dedication of our incredible core of election judges, the majority of whom return year after year because of their strongly held convictions that elections really do matter. This slide is the first of 2 that provides a high-level analysis of our election judges. As Council is aware, it is a strategic goal of EVS to diversify the makeup of its judge corps in order to ensure that our polling places more closely reflect the communities that we are serving. I need to preface that both of these slides I'm showing reflect data that is self-reported on a voluntary basis by our election judges. Not all judges choose to participate, so the data is not complete. And of course, we accept the data that's provided to us as it is self-reported by these individuals. With that caveat, however, it is not surprising to us that the majority of our election judges self-identify as female and that the bulk of these individuals are between the ages of 55 and higher. This slide shows the results of self-reported data centered on race and ethnicity. Clearly, the bulk of those participating identify as white or Caucasian. Only 23% of those participating in the surveys self-identified in another category, with the largest being African American at approximately 13%. I should note, 494 individuals chose not to participate in our surveys. That is equivalent to about 32% of our total pool of judges. So this data is significantly skewed if we present this and accept it on its face. However, anecdotally, I believe these numbers are not far off from the real target. We continue to make efforts and see some change year after year, but the greatest achievements we've made in this respect, and that is diversifying our core of judges, has been through our nationally recognized award-winning student election judge program. The city's student election judge program successfully recruited 225 students to work our primary in August this year. And I want to remind folks that what this means is that we were successful at identifying and recruiting students to work the primary during their summer recess from school. To me, that's incredible, and it speaks volumes about the dedication of our team who administers the student judge program, as well as those students who participated and took time during summer recess to complete training and serve in the polls for the August primary. Most of our student judges return year after year, and many even continue serving after they've moved on and graduated as adult team judges, having served several years in our student judge program. This demonstrates that our most important goal, the most important thing we do with the student election judge program, is achieving its success, and that is we are inspiring a new generation of voters who care, who show up, and who vote in elections. They witness firsthand the inner workings of our elections, and they work alongside adult mentors who share with them the value of free, fair, and equitable elections in this nation. And for that, we should all be extremely proud. Moreover, our student judges give us much needed diversity and critical skills in terms of secondary languages and facility with computers and technology. Last year, we deployed our electronic poll books, and it was in no small part a success due to the impact of our tech-savvy younger judges. In this August primary, roughly 50% of our students were bilingual and were able to assist voters who needed interpretation and translation support to access their ballots. This slide shows the sources where we draw students to our program. While the majority clearly come from Minneapolis public schools, I'm proud to note that we also have successful partnerships in place to recruit students as judges from area private schools, charter schools, and from other public schools that are not affiliated with the Minneapolis public school system. The voter outreach and education program started in 2013, and it's grown since that time to become a core component of elections and voter services. It is, quite honestly, a function for which Minneapolis has gained a solid reputation in this industry. Just this year, we were part of a national panel presentation on best practices for using social media to drive voter outreach initiatives. And our work in this area has been recognized by national organizations focused on election administration, voter rights, and government performance. And this has included the United States Elections Assistance Center, the National Center for Election Officials, the Democracy Fund, the Center for Technology and Civic Life, Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, and even Minnesota's Public Radio, just to name a few. I think it's fair to say that our efforts in voter outreach and education set the city of Minneapolis apart and ahead of many jurisdictions. And that's important because we, as a city, have clearly stated that we value easy access to the ballot for all eligible voters. In fact, a core tenet of our election judge training program, which is communicated to and shared by all of our election judges, is as follows. We will do everything in our power within the law to help you vote today. That's especially important at this point in our history. We recognize that the United States and even Minnesota, even Minneapolis, is challenged by inequities and inequalities. But the voting booth is one place where everyone is truly equal. Each person's vote counts exactly the same way, and each vote cast makes our government at all levels a bit more representative of the communities they're supposed to be serving. We create a responsive representative government, one vote at a time. And in that regard, it's absolutely true that every vote matters, including those votes that are never cast, either because eligible voters were unfairly prevented from participating or because the voter simply chooses not to engage. The more voters participate, the stronger our communities, our society, and our democracy become. And that is the impetus of our voter outreach and education program. The centerpiece to our outreach and communications work is, of course, our elections website, shown here. The website, combined with our social media platforms, enable us to connect directly with voters, providing important information about election dates, timelines, voting instructions, helpful resources, and information about voter rights and responsibilities. Just as we have in the past several years, Minneapolis is operating an early vote center to serve those voters choosing to cast absentee ballots in person prior to Election Day. The downtown early vote center, shown on this slide, opened on September 21 and will remain open through 5 p.m. on November 5. As of 5 p.m. last night, EVS has already served 1,985 in-person early voters. As already noted, extended hours at the early vote center begin next Monday, and direct balloting begins October 30th and runs through November 5th. In conjunction with direct balloting, we will be opening 3 additional early vote centers, as I mentioned previously. This slide shows the location of all 4 early vote centers, including the existing downtown site. The other 3 sites are as follows. For the north, we will be located at the Minneapolis Urban League at 2100 Plymouth Avenue North. The east site will be located at the University of Minnesota Fieldhouse at 1800 University Avenue Southeast. And the south site will be located at the Regents Assembly Church at 810 West 31st Street. All 4 early vote centers will be open from October 30th through November 5th, including weekend hours on Saturday, November 3 and Sunday, November 4. Details about each of these locations, including their operating hours, maps, details on how to get there with directions, and a buffer map that surrounds each of the locations, as well as other helpful information, are available from our elections website. Over the past several years, EVS has hired seasonal teams of outreach specialists to help promote awareness of this year's particular election, the importance of registration, and the ultimate goal of greater participation, especially from our targeted communities of historically underrepresented individuals. This year, EVS opted to what I call insource our scope of outreach work instead of outsourcing it, by working with our sister department, Neighborhood and Community Relations, and that partnership has been very successful. The NCR team of outreach specialists, some of whom are shown on this slide, have collaborated with EVS to promote this year's election, to generate awareness of key election dates, planned and coordinated a variety of community-based outreach efforts, including registration drives. They've hosted discussions with targeted community groups, and so much more. One example of this year's successful partnership was the leadership that NCR took in planning a number of concurrent community-based registration events as part of the 2018 National Voter Registration Day on September 25. On that day, NCR successfully registered 67 new voters and connected personally with 952 people to promote awareness of the general election and encourage participation. Outreach events were conducted at the North Market, the Lau Assistance Center, the Waite House, McCorvey Health and Wellness Center, Minneapolis Urban League, Powwow Grounds, Cedar Riverside Opportunity Center, Midtown Global Market, Stevens Square Block Control, and H. White Men's Room. This partnership this year between EVS and its sister departments, particularly NCR 311 Communications and IT, have significantly improved our work in this area of engaging and informing voters. The final piece that we plan for outreach and education this year is the 2018 voter guide. Building on successes from prior years, we're excited to send this mailer to every household in the city in the final week leading up to Election Day. As in the past, each guide contains important information about the 3 ways of voting, the races and questions that are on the ballot, how to access and use a sample ballot to practice and take to the polls, details about how to locate the precinct you're assigned to, the state's voter bill of rights, and more. The guides will be hitting households October 30th and 31st. That completes my prepared remarks, Mr. Chair, but before I stand for questions, I would, with your indulgence, like to recognize the team who's with me today. So many people contribute to the success of our elections, but first and foremost, it's the team of our election judges and seasonal workers who enable us to serve our voters. We're also grateful to our partners at the Secretary of State's office and the Hennepin County Elections Division, and to all of our sister city departments here at the city who help us in so many ways. And finally, to our team of election professionals under the leadership of Director Grace Walk-Larowitz. These are the group who make it happen. Minneapolis is truly fortunate to have a team with their knowledge and their experience, and I know that you appreciate their contributions just as I do, but I wanted to give them a special recognition for their amazing work at this time. And with that, I would be happy to respond to questions the committee might have.
Thank you, Mr. Casey Carl. And I think I can speak for my colleagues, hopefully, as I thank the elections team, deeply appreciate the work that you guys are doing to make sure that we have the kind of elections, the kind of robust and really competently executed elections that we have and that we're known for here in the city. So I want to sincere a deep thank you to you all. And I take the bus, and every day when I'm walking past the first floor, I see the election judge training happening. And so that's been really great to see over the last couple of weeks, to just be able to walk by that and know that as a city, we're in good hands. So thank you. With that, I want to know if my colleagues have any input. Council President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to echo your comments and just thank staff for always just going above and beyond. And you have our full support, but a lot of the work is coming from the innovation and dedication of our staff. And this is another place within the city that we are nationally recognized and known. And again, that's because of the work that our staff is doing every day, and we appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
Any other comments from colleagues? Awesome. With that, seeing nothing else nobody else having any questions, I will move to receive and file the staff report. All in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and that report will be filed. With no further business before the committee, we are adjourned. Thank you, guys.